Elton John rescues injured stray dog. What he did next. Rain pattered against the windshield of Elton John's limousine as it glided through London's back streets. The legendary musician had insisted on taking this route after his sold-out charity concert. A small act of nostalgia to glimpse the neighborhoods where his extraordinary journey had begun decades ago. "Sir Elton, we should be back at the hotel in 20 minutes, his driver announced. Elton nodded absently, his eyes fixed on the rain-slicked streets outside. At 75, he'd announced his retirement from touring, but charity events still called him to the stage. Tonight's performance had left him drained, yet fulfilled. The perfect balance of exhaustion and satisfaction. That's when he saw it. A flash of movement in the alley. "Stop the car," he said suddenly. "Sir, please, just stop for a moment." The driver complied, pulling to the curb. Before his security detail could protest, Elton had opened the door, the cold London rain immediately assaulting his designer suit. "Sir Elton, please," his bodyguard began, but Elton raised a hand to silence him. There, huddled against a dumpster, lay a dog. A small, trembling terrier mix with matted fur. Its right front paw was awkwardly bent, and a trail of blood mixed with rainwater beneath it. The animal's eyes, large and frightened, locked with Elton's. "Get me a blanket," Elton said quietly. Now, his security team exchanged glances but quickly retrieved a blanket from the trunk. Elton approached slowly, kneeling despite the puddles soaking through his custom trousers. The dog whimpered, attempting to back away but clearly unable to move properly. "It's all right," Elton whispered, his voice carrying the same gentle tone that had comforted millions through his music. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog's eyes remained fixed on him, wary, wounded, yet somehow hopeful. Elton felt a strange connection form, reminiscent of his own darkest days when he'd felt equally broken and alone. "Sir, the hotel is expecting us," his manager reminded nervously. "Change of plans," Elton replied, carefully wrapping the blanket around the trembling animal. As he lifted the dog, it yelped in pain, but didn't bite or struggle. "We need to find an emergency vet, now." "At this hour?" his manager protested. "I don't care if I have to wake the Queen's personal veterinarian," Elton said with quiet determination. "This dog needs help, and I'm going to make sure it gets it." The dog nestled against his chest, leaving smears of dirt and blood on his custom-made Gucci suit. A suit that had cost more than what many people earned in months. Elton didn't seem to notice or care. His assistant quickly located an emergency veterinary hospital 10 minutes away. As the limousine changed course, Elton gently stroked the dog's head. "What made you stop, Sir Elton?" his bodyguard asked carefully. "There are strays all over London." Elton continued petting the dog, who had begun to relax slightly in his arms. "I don't know exactly," he said truthfully. "Something in his eyes. I've seen that look before." He didn't elaborate, but his mind flashed back to his own lowest moments. The overdoses, the suicide attempts, the days when, despite being surrounded by fame and fortune, he'd felt utterly abandoned. "Do you think it belongs to someone?" his assistant asked. "No collar, completely matted fur. This little one has been on their own for quite some time," Elton replied. He lifted the blanket slightly to examine the dog more carefully. "It's a boy, I think, and he's been fighting to survive for a while." When they arrived at the veterinary hospital, the staff recognized Elton immediately. Their professionalism quickly overcame their surprise as the small dog was whisked away for emergency treatment. Elton insisted on staying, waving away his team's concerns about schedules and security. "Sir Elton," the veterinarian said, emerging from the examination room an hour later, her expression grave. "The dog has a broken leg, several infected wounds, and is severely malnourished. He's also not microchipped. Given his condition, many people would consider humane euthanasia." What the veterinarian couldn't know, was that just before the concert tonight, Elton had received news that his childhood friend and early bandmate had passed away after a long illness. It was a loss he'd been quietly carrying throughout the performance, another reminder of his own mortality and the passing of an era. Looking through the glass at the small dog now sedated on the examination table, Elton made a decision that would change far more lives than he could possibly imagine. "What would it take to save him?" he asked simply. The veterinarian blinked in surprise. "Surgery, certainly. Extensive rehabilitation. He's old too, probably around 8 or 9. Recovery would be—" "I didn't ask how difficult it would be," Elton interrupted gently. "I asked what it would take." But what happened next in that veterinary hospital would reveal connections neither Elton nor anyone else could have possibly anticipated. Connections that would lead to one of the most extraordinary acts of the musician's already remarkable life. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Elton's hotel suite as he sat beside the small carrier containing the rescued dog. Against the veterinarian's recommendations, and after signing numerous liability forms, he had insisted on bringing the animal back to his hotel after its emergency surgery. "Sir Elton, the press has caught wind of last night," his publicist said, tablet in hand. "They're calling. Everyone's calling." Elton waved dismissively, his attention fixed on the sedated dog. "Let them wait. Your husband is on the line again," his assistant added, holding out a phone. "This," Elton took. David's voice was a mixture of exasperation and fondness. "So I wake up to find you've adopted another stray?" "I haven't adopted him," Elton replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "I just couldn't leave him there." David hummed knowingly. "What did the vet say?" "Multiple surgeries needed. Broken leg, malnourishment, infected wounds. He's older, maybe 8 or 9. "And you're bringing him home to England?" Elton paused, watching the small chest of the dog rise and fall. "I haven't decided yet, but something about this dog, this small, broken creature, had touched something deep within him. Perhaps it was the timing, losing his old friend, and finding this abandoned soul on the same night. I've arranged for a specialist to come check on him," Elton said finally. "She should be here soon." When Dr. Amelia Chen arrived, she wasn't what Elton had expected. Young, confident, and seemingly unimpressed by his celebrity, she immediately went to work examining the dog. "You're the best veterinary surgeon in London?" Elton asked skeptically. "In the UK, actually," she replied without looking up. "Though I'm surprised your team found me. I don't exactly advertise." "Money finds expertise," Elton said with a shrug. Dr. Chen finally looked up, her expression softening as she met his eyes. "It's not about money. I was going to cancel all my appointments today, but when they said who you were..." She paused. "My mother was one of the children at the hospital in Glasgow. The one where you donated those specialized machines in 1992. Elton's expression shifted. "The children's respiratory unit?" She nodded. "She had severe cystic fibrosis. The doctors said she wouldn't live to see 18. She made it to 34, long enough to have me, thanks to those machines and the treatment protocol you funded." The room fell silent as the weight of this connection settled over them. "I didn't know," Elton said softly. "Few people do," Dr. Chen replied. "You never publicized that donation much." She returned her attention to the dog. "He needs extensive surgery on that leg. The emergency vet did good work stabilizing him, but..." She gently touched the matted fur. "There's something else." She carefully revealed what appeared to be a faded mark on the dog's skin beneath the fur. "This isn't a stray, Sir Elton. This dog was tattooed. It's what some breeders do. He was a breeding dog, probably discarded when he was no longer useful." Elton's jaw tightened. "Can you make out any identification?" "It's mostly scarred over, but I can try. It might help us learn where he came from." As Dr. Chen worked, Elton's phone rang again. It was the local animal control officer returning his call from earlier. "Mr. John, about your inquiry. We've had reports of an illegal breeding operation in that area, mostly terrier mixes for the designer dog market. When authorities got close, they likely dumped the older breeding dogs." Elton thanked him and hung up, a new determination hardening in his eyes. "Sir Elton," his manager interrupted, "the hotel needs to know how much longer we'll be staying. We're scheduled to fly back tomorrow, and there's the charity board meeting." "Cancel it," Elton said firmly. "Cancel what? The flight or the meeting?" "Both. All of it." Elton stood, energy suddenly radiating from him. "Dr. Chen, can you identify where this dog came from based on that tattoo?" She frowned, looking closer. "There's a partial code here that might match breeder registrations, but it would take time to trace." "I have resources," Elton said, already dialing another number. "And motivation." His security team exchanged worried glances. They recognized this look. The same determination that had built hospitals in Africa, raised hundreds of millions for AIDS research, and transformed the music industry multiple times over. When Elton John found a cause, nothing stood in his way. Within hours, his suite had transformed into an impromptu command center. His charitable foundation staff were routing calls, animal welfare experts were being consulted, and a legal team was preparing documents. Dr. Chen watched all this with amazement. "This is quite a response for one dog," she observed. Elton, now seated beside the sleeping animal, gently stroked its head. "It's never just about one, is it? One person with AIDS led to a global foundation. One friend lost to drugs led to rehabilitation centers. And now, one dog, she finished. Who deserves better? Elton said firmly. They all do. By afternoon, the fragments of information had coalesced into a disturbing picture. The breeding operation wasn't just illegal. It was cruel, extensive, and had political protection. The authorities had been trying to shut it down for months without success. We've identified at least 3 locations, his head of security reported, but without proper warrants. I don't need warrants, Elton interrupted. I need influence. He began scrolling through his phone contacts, a who's who of British power and influence. Get me the Home Secretary. Dr. Chen's eyes widened. You can just call the Home Secretary? We play tennis occasionally, Elton said absently, then spoke into the phone. Margaret, it's Elton. I need a favor. As Elton outlined what he'd discovered, the dog stirred, whimpering softly. Dr. Chen immediately checked his vitals and pain medication. He's fighting, she said quietly. Most dogs in his condition wouldn't have survived the night. Elton covered the phone. Does he have a chance? A good one, with proper care, she confirmed. But he'll need specialized treatment, physical therapy, whatever it takes, Elton said, returning to his call. When he hung up, the suite fell silent, waiting. The police will be raiding all 3 locations within the hour, he announced, with full media coverage. His manager looked concerned. Sir Elton, involving yourself in a police operation, this could be complicated. Life is complicated, Elton replied, his gaze returning to the small dog. But some choices are simple. What no one in the room yet realized was that this raid would uncover something far darker than an illegal breeding operation. Something that would connect directly back to Elton's own past in ways that would shock everyone, especially Elton himself. The raids happened with surprising efficiency. By midnight, Elton sat transfixed before the television in his suite, watching as police led away suspects and rescued dozens of dogs from squalid conditions. The little terrier, whom Elton had started calling Reg, after his own birth name Reginald, slept nearby, still heavily medicated but stable. 17 people arrested so far, his security chief reported, hanging up his phone. And over 60 dogs recovered. Dr. Chen, who had refused to leave her patient, looked up from her medical notes. Will they be okay? The other dogs? I've arranged for them to receive proper care, Elton assured her. My foundation is covering all expenses. Just then, Elton's phone buzzed with a message from the detective superintendent leading the operation. The text was brief, but urgent. Found something you need to see. Personal. Coming to you now. Elton frowned. What could be personal about a dog breeding operation? An hour later, Detective Superintendent James Collins arrived, carrying a weathered cardboard box. The police officer looked exhausted, but determined, as Elton's security team ushered him into the suite. Sir Elton, thank you for your assistance today, Collins began formally. What you've helped uncover goes far beyond animal abuse. He placed the box on the coffee table. The primary location we raided wasn't just a breeding facility. It was owned by a shell company, which we've traced back to Martin Spencer. Elton visibly stiffened at the name. Martin Spencer. Yes, your former... I know who he is. Elton cut him off sharply. Martin Spencer had been Elton's financial manager in the late 1980s, before being fired and later imprisoned for embezzling funds from several clients, including Elton. He had been released 5 years ago after serving his sentence. We found this hidden in his office safe, Collins continued, opening the box. Inside were folders, photographs, and what appeared to be old contracts. These aren't just business records. They're blackmail materials, dating back decades. Elton leaned forward, his expression guarded as Collins carefully removed a photo album. Spencer appears to have been collecting compromising information on prominent figures for years, including you, Sir Elton. Collins explained gently. We believe he was planning to leverage this for a comeback. Elton took the album with trembling hands. As he flipped through the pages, his face paled. These were private photos from his darkest days, the height of his addiction, moments of vulnerability never meant for public eyes. How did he get these? Elton whispered. He appears to have had people close to you on his payroll even back then, Collins replied. But there's more. The detective withdrew a yellowed envelope from the box. We found this letter. It was never sent. Elton opened it carefully. The handwriting was immediately familiar. His mother's. Dated just weeks before her death, it was addressed to him, expressing regret for her coldness throughout his life, and her pride in the man he had become. A letter of reconciliation he had never received. Spencer intercepted this? Elton asked, his voice barely audible. Collins nodded. It appears so. According to the records we found, he deliberately kept you estranged from family members when it served his financial interests. Elton sat back heavily, the letter clutched in his hand. His complex relationship with his mother had haunted him for decades, the warmth he had craved but never fully received. And all this time, this letter had existed, hidden away by a man who had already stolen millions from him. There's one more thing, Sir Elton, Collins said hesitantly, about the dog breeding operation. Dr. Chen, who had been listening silently, moved closer to Reg's carrier as if protectively. The property where we found the breeding dogs. It's registered to a company called Woodside Holdings. Elton looked up sharply. Woodside? That was the name of your childhood home, yes, Collins confirmed. Spencer seems to have used names and locations connected to you for his illegal operations. A twisted joke, perhaps. The room fell silent as the implications settled. This wasn't random. The dog Elton had rescued, found near the concert venue, bearing the marks of this specific breeding operation, was part of something deliberately connected to Elton's own life. He knew I'd be at that venue, Elton said slowly. The charity concert was announced months ago. We believe he may have orchestrated the dog's presence there. Collins agreed reluctantly, perhaps as some kind of perverse message. Elton moved to the carrier where Reg slept. The coincidence was too precise, finding this particular dog tied to his former manager on the night he'd learned of his friend's death. So this was all planned? Dr. Chen asked incredulously. To what end? Collins shook his head. Spencer was arrested at his home before the raid on the breeding facility. He seemed surprised by the timing. Our theory is that he was building towards some kind of confrontation or blackmail attempt, but you finding the dog wasn't part of his schedule. Fate intervened, Elton murmured, looking down at Reg. A sudden thought struck him. The other dogs at the facility, were any of them related to this one? Dr. Chen tilted her head. The tattoo patterns might tell us. Why? Just a feeling, Elton replied. But it was more than that. If Spencer had been building this operation using elements from Elton's life, perhaps there were other connections he hadn't yet seen. Elton turned to Collins. I want to see the facility. Sir Elton, that's an active crime scene. I don't care. I need to see it. He glanced at Dr. Chen. Is Reg stable enough to be moved? She hesitated. Yes, but I wouldn't recommend. We'll take him with us, Elton decided. I'll have my jet prepared. His manager, who had been silently observing, finally spoke up. Elton, this is becoming excessive. The police can handle this investigation. You've done your part. Elton turned to him, eyes blazing with an intensity his team hadn't seen in years. This stopped being about just a dog the moment we learned Spencer was involved. He didn't just steal my money. According to these records, he stole my chance at reconciliation with my mother before she died. What else did he take from me? No one had an answer. Prepare the jet, Elton said firmly. We're going to Woodside. As the team scrambled to make arrangements, Dr. Chen approached Elton privately. There's something I haven't mentioned about Reg, she said quietly. Something I noticed during my examination. What is it? She hesitated. His injuries, some of them are old, predating whatever happened to his leg. And there's a pattern to them that suggests, she took a deep breath. He wasn't just a breeding dog. I think he was used to test cosmetics or pharmaceuticals. Elton stared at her. What? The scarring patterns are distinctive. I've worked with rescue animals from testing facilities before. She glanced toward the sleeping dog. If I'm right, this goes beyond illegal breeding. It involves medical testing without proper licensing or oversight. Elton's expression hardened further. Spencer's other business ventures? Possibly. But the implications are significant. What neither of them yet realized was that the connection between Woodside Holdings, the drug testing, and Elton's past would reveal a conspiracy far more personal and devastating than either could imagine, one that would force Elton to confront not just Spencer's betrayal, but a truth about his childhood friend's recent death that would shake him to his core. The Resolution dawn broke over the rural English countryside as Elton's private jet touched down at a small regional airport. Despite his team's protests about security and his own health, the musician had insisted on this journey. Reg, sedated but stable in his specialized carrier, traveled with them under Dr. Chen's watchful care. The property is just 20 minutes from here, Detective Collins informed them, as they transferred to a convoy of black SUVs. The evidence collection team should be finishing up. Elton sat silently in the lead vehicle, the unopened letter from his mother clutched in his hand. He hadn't slept. The revelations of the previous day had unleashed a torrent of memories, painful recollections of his strained relationship with his mother, of Martin Spencer's betrayal, and most recently, of his childhood friend Peter's unexpected death. "You never said how your friend died, Dr. I," Chen remarked softly from the seat beside him, where she monitored Reg. Elton glanced at her, then out the window at the passing landscape. The official report said heart failure. But Peter had been participating in clinical trials for a new arthritis medication. He'd mentioned some concerning side effects in our last conversation. Dr. Chen's expression sharpened. "What was the name of the medication?" "Arthriclear." "Why?" Before she could answer, Collins's phone rang. After a brief conversation, his expression darkened. "Sir Elton, the forensic team found something significant in the records at Woodside. The breeding operation appears to have been a cover for an unauthorized pharmaceutical testing facility. They were testing a drug called AC-117. "Arthriclear," Dr. Chen whispered. Elton's head snapped toward her. "What?" "AC-117 is the development code for Arthriclear. I reviewed some early papers on it during my veterinary pharmacology studies." She looked disturbed. "It showed promising results for arthritis but had concerning cardiovascular side effects in animal trials." Elton felt the blood drain from his face. Peter said, "He said his heart felt strange after starting the medication." The convoy turned onto a narrow country road. At the end stood a compound surrounded by police vehicles and evidence collection vans. As they approached, Elton could see officers leading away the last of the rescued dogs. Inside the main building, Collins guided them through rooms filled with cages, medical equipment, and computers still being processed by the forensic team. The smell of antiseptic barely masked the underlying scent of neglect and fear. "This was where they kept the test subjects," Collins explained grimly. "The dogs were first bred for specific traits, then used for unregulated drug trials." Dr. Chen moved closer to Reggie's carrier. "That's why his medical issues are so complex. Multiple experimental treatments, likely without proper protocols or care." They entered an office where investigators were boxing up files. A detective approached Collins, speaking in hushed tones before handing over a tablet. Collins reviewed it quickly, his expression grave. "Sir Elton, we found communications between Spencer and Meridian Pharmaceuticals, the company developing Arthriclear. It appears they were using this facility to conduct unofficial tests that circumvented regulatory oversight, and Peter was in their official clinical trial." Elton said hollowly, "Yes. And according to these records, Spencer specifically recruited him." Collins hesitated. "There's more. Spencer was planning to approach you about investing in Meridian before their drug approval. He anticipated the stock would soar. Using my friend as a guinea pig while testing on these dogs," Elton's voice was deadly quiet, "and planning to profit from it." A forensic technician approached with another tablet. "Sir, we found this secured email exchange. You should see it." Collins reviewed it, then looked up at Elton with genuine sympathy. "It appears your friend Peter discovered the connection between his clinical trial and this facility. He was gathering evidence to expose them before he died," Elton whispered. The weight of this realization hit Elton like a physical blow. Peter hadn't just died. He'd been silenced. And in his final days, he'd been fighting against the very corruption that had now been exposed through a chance encounter with a small, injured dog. Elton moved to a window overlooking the compound. Outside, animal welfare workers were gently loading the last of the rescued dogs into specialized vehicles. "What happens to them now?" he asked quietly. "Most will need extensive rehabilitation," Dr. Chen replied. "Some may never fully recover from their physical or psychological trauma." Elton was silent for a long moment, then turned to face the room with newfound resolve. "I want to speak to Spencer," he said firmly. Collins shook his head. "That's not possible during an active investigation." "Make it possible," Elton interrupted. "I've spent decades wondering why my mother's attitude toward me never softened before her death. I've spent the last week grieving my oldest friend without knowing the truth of his passing. I deserve answers." 3 hours later, Elton sat across from Martin Spencer in an interview room at the local police station. At 68, Spencer had aged poorly. His once imposing frame now stooped, his expression a mixture of defiance and fear. "I have nothing to say to you," Spencer began. Elton placed the yellowed letter on the table between them. "You kept this from me." A dying woman's final words to her son. Spencer's eyes flickered to the letter, then away. "Why?" Elton pressed. "You'd already stolen millions from me. What did this give you?" Spencer remained silent. "Was it just cruelty?" Elton continued. Or was there a purpose? Did you need me isolated? Vulnerable? Was it easier to manipulate me if I believed my own mother couldn't love me? Spencer's jaw tightened. You were always your own worst enemy, Elton. I just exploited what was already there. And Peter? Was he just exploitation too? A flicker of genuine surprise crossed Spencer's face. Peter Thornton? What about him? He's dead, Elton said flatly. Heart failure after participating in clinical trials for arthroclear, the drug you were testing on dogs at your illegal facility. Spencer paled visibly. I didn't what? Didn't know he would die? Or didn't care? Elton leaned forward. He was investigating you. He found the connection. Impossible, Spencer whispered. He was smarter than you gave him credit for. Just like this dog. Elton nodded toward Reg, who lay in his carrier nearby, watchful despite his medication. You discarded them both when they were no longer useful, but they survived to bring you down. Back at his hotel that evening, Elton sat with David on a video call, recounting the day's revelations. The police have enough evidence to put Spencer away for the rest of his life, Elton concluded. And Meridian Pharmaceuticals is facing criminal charges and regulatory investigation. And Peter? David asked gently. His family has been notified. They'll have answers now at least. Elton's voice broke slightly. And evidence that he died trying to expose corruption. What about you? David's concern was evident even through the screen. This is a lot to process, love. Elton glanced at the corner of the room where Dr. Chen was examining Reg. The dog was more alert now, his intelligent eyes following the conversation. I've spent so many years defined by the absence of my mother's affection, Elton said slowly. Reading her letter, knowing she did love me, was proud of me. It changes things I thought were unchangeable. And the dogs? All of them? The Foundation is establishing a specialized rehabilitation center, Elton replied, for all animals recovered from testing facilities or breeding operations. We're calling it Peter's Place. Dr. Chen approached, a cautious smile on her face. He wants to say hello, she said, carefully lifting Reg and placing him gently on Elton's lap. For the first time, the dog was fully alert, studying Elton's face with intelligent, soulful eyes. Tentatively, his tail gave a single wag. Hello, Reg, Elton said softly. You've had quite the journey. The dog leaned forward hesitantly and licked Elton's hand once, a gesture of trust from a creature who had every reason never to trust again. Will you bring him home? David asked from the screen. Elton gently stroked the dog's head. Yes, but not just him. 1 month later, Elton John stood before a gathering of press, animal welfare advocates, and celebrities at the opening of Peter's Place, a state-of-the-art animal rehabilitation center built on 50 acres of prime countryside. Beside him, in a specially designed support harness, stood Reg, now recovering steadily. Every life has value, Elton told the assembled crowd. Every being deserves compassion. Sometimes it takes nearly losing something precious to remember what matters most. Photographers captured the moment as he knelt beside Reg, who now confidently leaned against his leg. My friend Peter died trying to protect both human and animal lives from exploitation, Elton continued. And this small dog, who survived unimaginable cruelty, led us to the truth. Together, they've created a legacy that will help thousands. Behind him stood 20 of the rescue dogs from the Woodside facility, each now in the care of specially trained rehabilitation experts. Many would eventually be adopted. Others, too traumatized or ill for traditional homes, would live out their lives in comfort at the sanctuary. I've spent my life creating music, Elton concluded, but sometimes the most important notes are the ones we don't plan, the chance encounters that become harmonies we never imagined. As the crowd applauded, Elton returned to the private area where David waited with their sons. Reg followed, his gait still uneven, but his spirit unbroken. Did Mum's letter really say all those things about you? Elton's oldest son asked quietly. Elton nodded, placing an arm around his son's shoulders. She was proud of me. She loved me. She just struggled to show it. Like the dogs, his son observed, looking at Reg. They need to learn to trust again. Exactly, Elton agreed. Some wounds heal quickly. Others take time, but healing is always possible. That evening, as the family settled into the cottage adjacent to the new sanctuary, Elton took a moment alone on the porch. Reg lay at his feet, contentedly chewing a toy. From this vantage point, Elton could see the rehabilitation center where lights still burned as staff tended to their charges. Next week, the first external cases would arrive. animals rescued from other testing facilities and breeding operations across Europe. His phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Chen, who had accepted the position as the center's lead veterinarian. Thought you'd want to know. The court granted full asset seizure from Spencer and Meridian. Their entire fortune will fund animal welfare and victim compensation. Elton smiled, setting down the phone to reach for his mother's letter, which he now carried with him everywhere. Reg looked up at the movement, then rested his head on Elton's foot in a gesture of companionship. You know, Reg, Elton said quietly to the dog. They say you can't change the past, but sometimes, if you're very lucky, the past can help you change the future. Reggie's tail thumped against the porch in what seemed like agreement, as the stars emerged above the sanctuary that neither of them had planned to build, but both had somehow needed to find.